Okay, so the final part of the introductory section is going to look at the third box here in the Getting Started section, which is designing your curriculum guidance. This section is within itself multifaceted. There are 5 parts to it that are shown on the screen here. The first part is the introduction. What this provides is some really important stimulus questions when thinking about designing and implementing the curriculum. Now, some of these questions are questions that we ask ourselves regardless of which curriculum we were designing in the past. For example, building high expectations. How does the curriculum build high expectations, enable all learners to achieve their full potential? But some of these questions are questions that perhaps we haven't asked previously when designing and developing our questions. So the question I've highlighted here: support your learners' health and well-being, including their mental health and well-being. Well-being is both a purpose in this curriculum, and it's also an area of learning experience. So it's important that we have due regard in thinking about this in the way we design our curriculum. The question underneath is also one perhaps that we haven't asked as much in previous curricula. So how do we support our learners' development of knowledge that is the foundation of being an informed citizen? So what knowledge do they need in order to be critically engaged in a modern participative democracy in which we live? What do they need to know about the political systems? What do they need to know about some of those global issues that are going on at the moment? And what's it important to learn at different ages as we move through the continuum? So there are some important questions here. Another question I think perhaps that comes to the fore in this curriculum is: how do we build in construction with learners, families, and the wider community our curriculum? So to what extent are we going to work with our partners in those areas to start thinking about what is important for our young people to learn? How do we start to begin to build that dialogue? So some important questions there in that introductory part around those questions for supporting the design of our curriculum. The second part of the Designing Your Curriculum section focuses around developing a vision for curriculum design. Key question here, I think, is: to what extent is our vision for learning and the vision for our curriculum for our young people in our school, to what extent is that underpinned by the 4 purposes of the curriculum? Not just the pairs of purposes as set out in terms of the ambitious, capable and the enterprising, creative, but actually the detail of the bullets that sits beneath. And then to what extent is that vision realised through our curriculum, underpinned by the values of our institution? So some big questions there in the first instance. Also, to what extent are the various stakeholders who work with us engaged in shaping our vision with us? To what extent are our pupils involved, our parents and local community, and all of our teachers involved in shaping that vision for learning in school? One of the other parts of this section then is around the integral skills. So the integral skills used to be known as the wider skills. These are the skills that were previously assessed through the Welsh Baccalaureate. So the skills of creativity and innovation, critical thinking and problem solving, personal effectiveness, and planning and organisation. And as set out here, the 4 purposes are underpinned by these integral skills, which should be developed within a wide range of learning and teaching. So really, if we need to give our learners the opportunity to develop and exemplify these skills in order to support the fulfilment of the 4 purposes. In addition to that, there are the cross-curricular skills, so the skills of literacy, numeracy, and digital competence, which will also help us to underpin and to realise the 4 purposes of the curriculum as well. So quite a bit of useful thinking here in terms of how we shape that vision for learning in our schools. This section of the guidance then goes on to consider progression and how this underpins curriculum design. It talks through the 5 principles of progression, which are covered later in this professional learning session, but the increased breadth and depth of knowledge, the deepening understanding of the areas and disciplines within the areas of learning, the refining and growing sophistication in the use of the application of skills, and the making connections and transferring learning into new context, and the increasing effectiveness as a learner. So those are the 5 principles of progression that underpin the progression in the 5 areas of learning and experience, so are common across the whole curriculum framework. So they are given some an opportunity there to be explored in greater detail in the guidance. And then the final part of this section looks at designing a curriculum in Wales for Wales. So thinking about the fact that this framework reflects Wales, its cultural heritage and diversity, its languages and the values, histories, traditions of its communities and of its people. It talks about the important idea here of Cynefin, the fact that learners should be grounded in understanding of the identities, landscape and histories of Wales as part of their study through the curriculum, that it's important that learners learn from a broad range of local, national and international contexts through this framework. And the framework also promotes this idea of us being a bilingual nation, and that all learners should have the appropriate pathways for English and Welsh to enable them to develop confidence in using both of those languages as part of their daily life. So quite a lot of information there. It goes on to talk about assessment as well. However, that's covered in greater detail later on in this professional learning session. So the final section of this guidance is going to have a little look at the principles for designing your curriculum. This section does exactly what it says. It looks at what some of the key principles should be. Now, the first section simply reiterates a lot of what's in the legislative framework. So, based on the curriculum requirements set in legislation, curriculum must do these things, which we've covered in a previous section. But this is the important new information, the important material I think we need to engage with. So, using the guidance to select curriculum content. This is a curriculum framework which has not specified content to a large degree in areas of learning and experience, and therefore the choices that we make as professionals around the curriculum framework become increasingly important. So what this section sets out is how do we make some of those decisions around curriculum content. And basically what it suggests is that there are three parts of the curriculum framework from which will help us to support us to make those decisions. So the first is the statements of what matters, the next is the descriptions of learning, and also we need to reference the principles of progression as well. So if we look at the statements of what matters we know from the framework that it's important that we cover each of the 27 statements of what matters through the continuum of learning. So what are the how do the what matters help us to select the relevant content for our young people? Well, the 4 bullets here summarize how they do this. So in the first instance, look at an example, select experiences, knowledge and skills. So the statements of what matters sum up the big ideas or the key principles of each area, and content selected should enable learners to develop an understanding of the statements of what matters. So the first thing that the what matters do is help us to select experiences, knowledge and skills, and we'll see an example of that later on. Here's another example, the 4th bullet. They help learners to make sense of a range of experiences, knowledge and skills focused around the fundamentals of each area. So using the statements of what matters to underpin learning helps learners develop a coherent understanding of a range of information, make connections between different aspects of learning rather than accumulating isolated facts, as this was one of the big critiques, one of the big criticisms of previous curricula, was that actually often subjects were taught completely in isolation, and rather than making links and connections across areas of learning, pupils simply accumulated lots of isolated facts and activities that they weren't able to draw together to form a bigger whole in terms of their learning. If we move then into the descriptions of learning, in the first instance, this paragraph provides quite a nice definition, nice explanation of what the descriptions of learning are and do. So they provide guidance on how learners should progress within each statement of what matters as they journey through the curriculum, the continuum of learning. They arrange in the 5 progression step, which we've previously discussed in this section. And what they are designed to do is to sustain learning over a period of years and give practitioners scope to use them to select content that provides both breadth and depth. So if we look at breadth and depth in a little bit more detail, in terms of the breadth, practitioners should use the descriptions of learning to bring together a broad range of experiences, knowledge and skills. They should be explored through a range of contexts, topics and activities selected in the process of curriculum design. So an example we'll look at later in this session in the humanities is the idea of, or the concept of, inquiry. Now clearly clearly what we wouldn't want to do is simply one inquiry at one point in time across a learning continuum. What we'd want pupils to experience is inquiry on a number of different points in the continuum, and also across the range of disciplines within the humanities. So breadth is important, as is depth. So here, what we're talking about is teachers supporting learners to engage with these descriptions of learning with increasing depth and sophistication over time. So just a really simple example from the science and technology area of learning, progression step 3, around the world around us is full of living things depending on each other for survival, which is one of the what matters. One of the examples is given is, for example, to explain the role of different organs and systems that enable plants and animals to live and grow at progression step 3. That deepens and becomes more sophisticated at progression step 4. I can describe the levels of cellular organization and how cells perform biological processes that ensure the development and survival of organisms. So it's taking that concept and that idea and really deepening a level of understanding around it. So depth is obviously increasingly important as well. Also, what's mentioned here is where overlaps in learning exist, descriptions of learning are designed to be considered through a range of disciplinary lenses, and practitioners should seek to incorporate these disciplinary perspectives into learning. So there will be issues that run across the curriculum that require looking at through a variety of different lenses, some of the big issues of the day. The next point here around principles of progression is a reasonably simple one. Progression in learning should always be at the heart of curriculum design rather than starting with a theme and fitting the learning into it. In selecting curriculum content, schools and practitioners must use the principles of progression, the 5 that are common across the areas of learning, to inform their approach to progression. So that's in the final section of this part of the framework, the roles of disciplines in learning are discussed. In particular, the fact that the guidance has been developed to support the approach that draws together the different disciplines in curriculum design. The idea being to provide learners with a more coherent learning experience as they make connections within their learning, and combining a range of statements as different areas can allow them to consider curriculum content from a range of perspectives and disciplines. So that's the way that the curriculum has been designed. However, it is also clearly important that learners should have the opportunities to specialise. In the guidance here, it talks about specialising as we move through the framework. So when learners move to their options post-16, they have sufficient disciplinary understanding and knowledge to be able to move on to other pathways. But obviously, it's also important that young people are able to access the appropriate disciplinary teaching. So, for example, in the development of mathematical or language skills at earlier points in the framework, to support their skills development, and that the appropriate pedagogies are selected to support this. And certainly that's very clear when we look at the way in which the mathematics and numeracy area of learning experience has been developed.